Okay, hello everyone. Do another lecture video here for CPSC 1012, working with arrays. Moving on in the lessons for the course. So in this video lecture, I'm hoping to demonstrate how to declare arrays in C#. We'll load an array with values input by the user, so we can look a little bit at how that's going to work versus just filling an entire array. We'll have to track the input values in the count. And then also, once we've entered in our values, we need some way to go through the array, visit each value that's in the array, each element, and then we'll just display. And I think the problem we're going to work on here is going to also ask us to do some arithmetic, nothing too crazy, but a little something, just to show how we can process the values that are stored in the array as well. All right, so without wasting any more time, let's get it. Okay, so the problem set I've chosen for this lecture today is from the Array Problems 1 document that's posted to Moodle. There are a number of questions here to kind of work through. We'll look at the first one. So I'll do this with you together in this lecture video, and then I'll have a follow-up supplementary video that will tackle question 2. And then what I would recommend for you to work on then would be questions 3, 4, to the end here. Oops, kind of scrolling is a bit terrible. But yeah, and I would say this question 4, if you can get through this, is a really good question to prepare you for working on assignment 3. So in a previous session, I'd laid out some exercises that I thought would be very helpful for working with methods in the previous lecture. And for this particular case, we're working with arrays. I think question number 4 here from this problem set is extremely useful when it will come to applying a similar logic and planning to the assignment that's been posted. So anyway, that's just what I think. You don't have to do that, but that's what I recommend. So let's just get right into the problem here. So question number 1 says, or asks us to create a program that will allow the user to enter up to 25 numbers, and without saying as much, we're going to put them into an array. Okay, we could declare 25 variables, but again, one of the benefits of working with arrays is that we don't have to manage a large number of variables. We can just use an array and store all the values that we need or we think we need inside. And then there's a follow-up piece here, which is to say we need to calculate and display the mean average of the numbers that are entered. So it's pretty straightforward. Input values, continue to input values. In this example, we're asked here to allow the user to enter up to 25. So we're given what the physical size or the length of the array needs to be. We've got to be able to have the capacity to hold 25 numbers and no more, but we don't have to enter in 25 numbers, right? So we're going to allow the user to enter up to 25 numbers. So that indicates that we're going to have to also track a count of the number of elements that are actually stored in the array or the logical size. Okay, so we're going to have to track that somehow on our own, and then give the user some mechanism to say, hey, I don't want to enter in any more values. So there are a number of ways to do that. One of them could be simply to just upfront prompt the user for how many numbers they plan on entering. So we could just say, how many numbers are you going to enter, and perhaps they say 5, and then you ask for 5 numbers. So we could implement a counter-controlled loop in that sense, or we may just prompt the user for values and give them an option to choose whether or not they'd like to enter in another one. And then we don't have to ask them up front how many they want to enter. One at a time, they would indicate to us that they want to continue entering values or not. Okay, so again, I'm not here to mandate either approach. I think we'll go with the second, which is to just ask the user if they'd like to enter another one. There's a bit of nuance, some difference in the logic that we need to apply to do something like that versus a counter control loop, which is pretty straightforward, right? We know the number of times to do it, so we'll just ask 5 times. Versus, okay, well, what do we have to do? We need a response variable. We need to check the response variable, and we also need to check the room that's available in the array. So I'm going to choose the latter option just so we can explore those options. And then once we've entered in the values, all we're going to do is just immediately loop over those values and then calculate a mean average. And the mean average really is just the sum of the entered values divided by the count of the number of values. So that's pretty straightforward. We can use a counter control loop to do the traversal of the array because we do know how many numbers are stored. We don't need to do any interaction with the user to calculate that value. So we'll get to see both a for loops approach to traversing the array, and then we'll just use like a do while approach to filling the array. So again here, it's pretty straightforward. There isn't a lot of context or noise or nuance surrounding the problem. I think you can't really restate this any better than it is here. So I'm just going to leave that alone. And as far as like a planning model goes, again here, we're not going to do a whole bunch. We're really going to get input from the user, again, times n, however many times we need to do. We know the maximum in this example is 25, so we do have a cap. So we don't know how many times the user is going to enter a number, but they're not going to enter more than 25. And then once we finish that, we're going to have to calculate a mean, and then we're going to have to display the mean average to the user. So as a pretty simple model, I think that works well to identify and highlight the pieces of the problem that we're going to solve. And so now we can get into the meat and potatoes of dealing with it. Again, here, without getting too much into the weeds of the pseudocode and the planning, I'm going to, for this example, just stay away from the idea of, a program title and, things like that. The purpose of this lecture isn't to really go through all the details of creating a flow program. It's really to focus on how we can declare an array and use an array. So those are the pieces that are important. We can plan out the parts of getting the input and then just calculating the mean average. So we know that we're going to need a mechanism. Oops. Here we go. To store the values, right, and to enter the values. So let's do that now. So we're going to have to declare a few pieces. So we're going to need basically our numbers, and that's going to be an integer array. It doesn't say here whether they need to be integers or they need to be floating point real numbers. So we could just, to make life easier, we'll just go with the integer value. So we're going to create numbers as an integer array. We haven't created it, so we'll come back to that in a minute. And then we'll also need to track, in this example, the number of entries. So we could just use like a count of nums, something like that, as an integer. And this is important. We need to do an initialization on the counter because we're going to be tracking every time the user inputs a new value. We want to say, okay, they've entered in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So in order to properly increment this variable, we need to initialize it to 0, right? When the program begins, the current count of the numbers in the array is 0, so we can initialize it as such. And we could declare a variable to track and hold the input from the user, or we could just utilize the array kind of like for what it is for and just have the user enter numbers directly in. Again, we're not doing any validation on the value here. So for example, we're not limited. There's no constraints on whether the number needs to be positive or negative. It just needs to be a number. So we can just, as long as the user is entering numbers, we can just slot them directly into the array. We don't have to do any validation. So these are kind of the two big pieces. The one thing we haven't done at this point is indicate the size of the array. So I'm saying let's declare numbers as an array of integers, but we haven't said anything about it. And again, in the pseudocode here, we could do that later on. Sometimes you might just declare an array variable, and perhaps as part of the program, you prompt the user for how many numbers they'd like to store, and then you could just create the array at that time. You could initialize it and so that it has a physical size that matches whatever the user wants. But in this example, we're told straight up that it should hold up to 25 numbers. We don't need to ask the user how many numbers they're going to enter in that sense, so we could just declare it. So a couple ways to do that. In pseudocode, I'd be fine if you just did something like this. That's clear enough to me. You're declaring numbers as an integer and it should be able to hold 25 elements. That's totally fine. If you wanted to do something a little bit more explicit and do an assignment of something like, integer 25, that's totally fine too. Again, the planning is more for you than it is as a part of like a submission for this assignments in this course or anything. So again, use some kind of structure and be consistent in your planning so that it makes sense. Oops. Again, I'm easy either way. Doesn't really matter. So once we have those pieces, the first piece we need to get into is to load values into the array. And so we could take the assumption that we're going to do this at least once. So we could say do something, and we're going to continue to do that while something is true. We don't know what that is yet, but I can tell you one of the things is while there's room. So we can't keep asking for input values forever, right? We have a hard cap on the size of the array. It can only hold 25. So we know that that's going to be a piece here. But again, like I mentioned, we're also going to have another piece, which is, hey, user, do you want to enter in any more numbers? And, if they choose no, it doesn't matter if there's any more room left in the array. If they say I don't want to enter anymore, we're just going to stop. So that's another piece that we need to add in here. So we need some kind of a response. And just to keep things easy, I'll just do that as a string for now. Okay, so keeping those two things together, we have a count of the nums, right? And we also have a response. We can kind of jump to what our condition would be and saying, okay, we're going to continue to do whatever, ask for values from the user, and we're going to continue to do that while there's two things that are true. One is the count of nums has to be less than 25. Okay. Again, I don't like literal 25s, but this is just general planning. We'll come back to that in a moment. So while the count of the nums is less than 25, right, that means we haven't input 25 numbers. We can continue to ask, but we've also got the second piece, which is that we also have to test and, something like our response is equal to, y or something like that. So two things need to be true in order for us to continue entering values. We have to have room, and the user has to have indicated they want to do that. And once we've got those two things in place, the rest of this is pretty straightforward. Again, this isn't new. You already know how to construct conditions, create loops, and things like that. So this is pretty straightforward. The new piece will be in how we actually put values into the array. So we can do something like the following. We can prompt the user, enter a number. We could even, use the count as part of the prompt to say like enter number 1, enter number 2. Maybe we'll do that in our code, but for now this is fine. So we say enter a number, and we're going to store that in the array of numbers. Okay, so numbers is an array. We have the variable identifier, and we indicate that it is an array that we want to access an element in by appending the brackets. Okay, and so the brackets are used to allow us to specify the index. So the index of which element in the array are we wanting to put this value in? And the first index in zero-based arrays is 0. And since our count begins or is initialized at 0, we can use the count as a placeholder here. So we can say count of nums at that location at the index of 0 the first time. That's where we'd like to put the number that was input by the user. Okay, and so once we've stored that number in the array, the next very important piece is to increment the count. So now we no longer have 0 numbers in the array, we have 1. So we need to set our count of nums equal to the count of nums plus 1. Okay, so that does the array loading part. Right, so here we can enter a value into the array, and then the next piece is going to be, ask, whether the user would like to continue. So we can do a simple prompt here, prompt enter another number, and we could do y or an n, and we'll input that into response. I've got a capital Y here, but we could go with lowercase y too. That's fine. Oops. Okay, so that's really kind of it. That's our logic for loading, and in this case, supporting a partially filled array. We may reach 25 elements, but we may not, right? And if we know, again, given the problem statement here, that we potentially may not fill the entire array, then we have to track this logical size separately. If the array was just going to be filled, then rather than utilize even 25 here, we could have just set up some kind of like a counter-controlled loop where we simply use the length of the array or the physical size, and that's it. We don't have to do any of this additional tracking of a count. But we've got two sizes here. One of them is how many elements can fit in physically, and then the second is the logical size. Well, how many are we actually tracking inside the physical range? So that's it for inputting values. I think that'll work out okay. And then the second piece is going to be to calculate and display the mean average. Okay, so now that we have, at this point, loaded all of the input values into the array, we can now loop over those values, calculate the sum, and then we have a count of how many numbers are in there. We can just simply divide the sum by this count. So the traversal loop here to go over the elements in the array is really just to sum the values that happen to be in it. And again, since we know how many elements there are, we can set up a for loop. So we can set up for, we can declare a local for counter. So I'll say something like integer idx, beginning with the first element, while that idx variable is less than, in this case, it's count of nums. So again, if we knew that the array was full, we could just use the length or the physical size of the array, but it's not full. So right, we've kept track of how many elements there are using this count of nums variable. So that's what we've got to use here as part of the condition. Okay, and then for every time we loop over, we're going to, I'll just be explicit, idx plus 1. Okay, so that's simple. Again, counter control loop, very common for processing arrays. C# also has support for a for each loop, but again, I'm going to stick to just a general for loop because the logic is sound and can be applied pretty much everywhere, but different languages will have different supports for iterating over lists or collections or arrays. So you could look for that for each syntax. Unless it's explicit in an assignment or something, I'm fine with you using it. But again, for just covering the fundamentals that we're supposed to be doing in this course, I'm going to just use the for loop. That's pretty universal. So starting at index 0, what we need to do is track a sum value. And I don't have a place to do that. So let's go up here and declare an additional variable. So we can declare sum, and that's going to be an integer, and we need to again initialize that to 0. We haven't summed anything yet, so let's just start at the 0 position. And so what we need to do every time we loop over an element in the array is we need to add that value to the sum. So we can set our sum equal to its current value, which would be 0 the first time, and then we just add in from numbers, again, an element within numbers at the particular index. So if the first case index is 0, so we're going to be taking the value at index 0, and we're going to add that to the current sum, and then we're going to assign that to the sum. So this will just keep adding on. So plus equals if you wanted to do it that way, but this is very explicit. So set the sum equal to its current value plus whatever is in the array at this particular index, and then we increment our index by 1, and now we go to the second, right? And if there's room, we get that value. And then so once we're finished, we can just display the mean. So we could We could go one step further. We could declare a variable for that too. Or since we're not using it anywhere, we could just display it direct, but we don't need to initialize that variable. We'll be setting it here. So now we can do something like set the mean equal to the sum divided by the count of the nums. And then we can display, something like the mean average is, and then we just put out here mean. Okay. And then that would be, effectively the end of the program. There's nothing else to do. That pretty much covers everything. So again, just giving this a quick walkthrough, right? We're going to declare our variables. We're going to enter numbers from the user, store them directly in the array. We're going to increment the count every time we get a number in, and then we're going to ask the user if they'd like to enter another one. If there's still room and they said yes, we'll do that again. Okay. We could add again some additional information. So for the prompt, we might only even ask them if there's room. So we could have an if, if the count is still less than 25, then prompt them, right? Otherwise, it's full. There's no reason to. So there are little things like that you could still add to this to make it a bit more user-friendly. Again, here, instead of just prompting enter a number, we could say enter number 1, enter number 2. I'll leave those as an exercise for you to implement in the program. But we'll just kind of get to implementing this so we can see how it's going to work. And so then once we've entered in the numbers that we need, then we loop, right? Very typical for loop. We loop over the elements in the array. We track and calculate the sum, and then we declare our mean and then display it. So now that we have this plan, let's go ahead and implement it and see how that's going to look. So Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new console application. Let's call this one, I don't know what it is, less than 6, and I'll just call it arrays. And away we go. So again, the nice thing about having this plan is we're not starting from scratch here, integrating syntax and code with the problem solving. We've already kind of done that. We're just going to basically take this over and apply it. So let's start by killing this scaffold piece. And like I said before, if you want to include a program title and everything, again, do that. I'm just going to go through the plan so we can save on time. So we need to declare our variables. So we've got an array. So int is the type. Put the brackets on the type to indicate that it's going to be an array. We've called it numbers. And I'm going to do this in 2 steps, and I'll show you why in a moment. So we'll just declare that variable. We have an int, which is the count of nums. We initialize that to 0. Oops. And then we have an int for our sum, which we initialize to 0. And what else did we have? Oh, we had a mean variable as well in response. So we'll do those 2. So int mean and string response. Okay, now there are a couple ways to do this. The numbers array up here, if we wanted to track and only use the max size, once, we could just assign it straight away and just to say this is going to be a new int with 25 elements. So again, this is, I think, pretty straightforward to read. This on its own just declares a variable that can reference an array. Okay, so again, if you go through the lesson notes, again, arrays are reference types. There's no, the elements themselves aren't stored in the variable. The variable is a variable that can basically point to or refer to where we can find the array of values. So declaring it on its own just says what it can point to. So in this sense, we're declaring it and then creating an actual array, right, that can hold 25 integer values, and we're saying that this numbers variable references this array. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be if we wanted to track the max size explicitly, we could say here, declare the variable, and then maybe we use a constant. So I'll have constant int max size and specify that as 25. And then here we can initialize the array, and we could say that numbers is a new int array of max size. Okay. Again, in this example, I'm going to make use of the max size as part of our loop, but we could also access the length. So there is a dot length property that we can use. So at this point, the length property would be synonymous with max size. The difference between accessing the two is that this is a constant that's direct access. We just get the value straight away. Whereas when you use something like numbers dot length, there's like an internal process that has to happen. So we need to find the numbers array, and then we need to go and say, well, what's the length of it? So this could be considered a bit more efficient to just directly go to the constant. Again, for this course, I'm totally fine if you just use numbers.length anywhere that it makes sense to use it. So again, two ways to go about initializing the array. You could have done it straight away up here, or we could do it in the way that we see here where I'm declaring it and initializing it separately. So once we've now created the numbers, it can hold 25 values. We're ready to get into our loading of the array. So again, you could like copy and paste this over or just type it out. It's up to you. So we're going to do something. We're going to do this while the count of nums is less than the max size. Oops. And the response, I'll use equals y. Okay, response hasn't been assigned a value yet, so that's why it's complaining, but that's fine. We'll put a prompt in, which will take care of that. Okay. Again, for me, this is just preference. You don't have to do it this way. You could have, first of all, just done the body and then added the loop afterwards. But my preference is to put the structure of my program in place and then deal kind of with the guts. Because creating a do while is, the same. It's a pattern. I like to apply the patterns and then put the details in after the fact. So here now we can begin to prompt for input. So we can do our console.write. Oops. And we can say enter a number. And then we can capture that number. So this is where you would typically use a variable to store the value, right? You'd say something like x is assigned, and then we would do an int.parse in this example, console.readline. So all we're changing here is to say we don't have a single variable that holds just a simple int value. We've instead got a reference to an array. So numbers says, hey, I access an array where I can store up to 25 numbers, right? 25 elements in this array. So what we need to say is we can't assign an int to numbers because the type of numbers is an array reference. So that's not going to work. What we need to do is include the brackets and say, well, at what index do we want to store this value? And for us, we'll utilize our count of the nums since it begins at 0 as an access or an index to the first location in numbers. So this statement here reads, go to the numbers array, specifically the 0 index element, and assign that a value. Okay, so we have one variable that's a reference to, in this example, a set or a collection or a list of 25 unnamed variables, right? We can store 25 values, we can access them, but they each don't have their own unique name. So that's essentially what the array is allowing us to do. Instead of having int num1, int num2, int num3, etc., we just declare one array reference, specify the maximum number of elements we think we're going to be able to store, and now we can just pop those in there. And so long as we're able to utilize an index reference, we can get any element that's in that array. So that's how that looks. Okay, so this is going to take an input, put it in there. Now, if we don't increment the count, two things will happen. One, this will always be true. 0 will always be less than 25, so that would become pointless. But if you looped around, the next input value would just overwrite the previous one. So if this remained 0 and we looped around again, we would ask the user for another number, and we would just overwrite the current value at index 0 with a new value. So again, very important when you're dealing with arrays that you have an index variable and that you increment or decrement it as necessary. So here we can do that piece now. We can say the count of the nums is plus equals 1, right? We're going to add 1 to that. So we've gone from 0 to 1. which is an accurate count of the number of elements in the array, but it will also act as the second index value. So when we loop around, numbers at index 1 will be brand new. We'll put a value in there, and we'll increment so that we have 2 elements in it. Right? So that's, I hope, pretty straightforward, but that's pretty much the key to loading values into the array. Have an index variable, make sure you increment or decrement appropriately, and then use it in the right way to assign values. And so once we've done that, that's really the piece where we deal with the arrays. The next part is to prompt the user to say, do you want to enter any more? So again, we can do the same thing. We can do a console.write, and we can say, enter another number, and they'll enter yes or no. And then I'm going to do to lower so that we know we're dealing with a lowercase y. So here we can do response is assigned console read line to lower. Okay, so a lowercase y on its own is the only thing that's going to match. So if they type in yes, that's not going to match. If they type in z, that's not going to match. It's only a y, which is fine. Again, we could make updates to this to make it a bit more user-friendly, but that's not really the point of this video. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. We can loop through, we can pop those values in. Fantastic. Okay, and again, since we're in control of however many we want to enter, we can enter 1, 2, or 3 and then test to see that it works, which is what we'll do in a moment. So that's the loading piece. So load values into the array. And once we're finished with that, now we can calculate the sum. So calculate the sum of the numbers in the array. And for that, we can use a counter control loop. We know how many numbers are in there. So it's easy to set up. We can set up for int an index that begins at 0. Again, while that index is less than. So here we could use the max. Here we could use the max size. But if you didn't have the constant max size, so like I said before, if instead of using a constant to initialize numbers, if instead here you just said int array numbers is assigned new int and just use 25, and you didn't have this, then in place of the constant here, you could use numbers.length. Okay, that would be the same kind of idea. But rather than go to the array and ask all the time, I already have max size as a constant, so we'll just use it. If we change max size, the array length will change and it will be updated everywhere else that we use that. So again, good use of the constant. If you declare a constant and you see it multiple times through your program, you know that that was the right choice. And so once we determine that this is true, there are more numbers in there. Oh, sorry. I spent all this time talking about tracking the logical size. No, this is not going to work. This is only going to work if the array is filled. It's not filled. We need to use the count of the nums in this particular example. So pardon me, I got carried away there. If you knew the array was filled, then we would use the length of the physical size or the max size, but we don't. The reason we put this variable in was to track how many. So apologies. I would edit that out, but now I make mistakes too, so there you go. So while the index is less than the count of the numbers, same kind of idea, we want to increment our index by 1. Okay, good. So if we entered in only 3 numbers, we would go 0, 1, and 2, which is less than 3, and that would be our final 3 elements in the array. So that logic makes sense. And all we're going to do here is take our sum, and it's sum plus itself, and then assign back the value in numbers at the current index. So that's all that does. Nothing too crazy there. And then we calculate the mean, which the comment is not really necessary. This should be pretty self-explanatory. Right, so the mean is going to be assigned the sum divided by the count of the numbers, and then finally we can display. So console write line, and we'll use a string interpolation here. So we'll say something like the mean of the numbers is mean. Okay, and yeah, I won't worry about formatting it or anything like that. So again, these two patterns that I've shown you here are very common. So it's not a matter of like, okay, I've got a problem that deals with arrays. It's going to be tricky. It's I'm going to have to load values into the array, and I'm going to have to traverse the elements that are in the array. And so again, if you can kind of get into the habit of identifying these patterns, any problem that you face that has or makes use of an array will be processed in essentially the same way. You'll have some kind of loop where you have an index to use to assign values in, and once you're traversing the elements that are already in the array, it's almost always just a simple for loop. We know we start at the 0. Sometimes you might want to do it in reverse order. So maybe your index begins at the length -1 or count of nums -1 in this case and goes down through 0. Regardless, it's the same setup every time. Nothing really changes. It's just what are you doing with the values that are in the array, right? How are you loading them and what are you doing with them? But these two structures are pretty much given. So that's it, right? Again, practice with these two things. Well, let's give this a test to see if everything works. I think it might work, but that's why you've always got to, you can't just type the code and walk away. We've got to actually put it through its paces. So let's see what happens here. It's taking a moment here. No good. Well, let's try one more time. Oh, I ran an update in my Visual Studio. It looks like it's embedding my terminal. So fantastic. Note to self, when you run updates on your software, test it and make sure the changes are good. So that's kind of nice. All right, we have integrated terminal here. So enter a number, right? So we're in our for loop. So I'll enter a number, 5. And then we get prompted, do you want to enter another one? I'll say yes. Good. So that works. Enter another number. We'll use 10. And yes, I want to enter another number, and I'll enter in 15. So nice numbers so we can kind of determine what we should end up with for a mean value. So after that, I'll say no, I don't want to enter any more numbers. And we should see that the mean value comes out as 10. And of course, it does. So that's it, right? Very, very simple program to get acquainted with working with loading arrays and traversing an array. And like I said, if you like to get more insight, you can set breakpoints and walk through this code to see exactly how it's working. I'll leave that as an exercise for you as well. But that's it. There really isn't much else to say about working with arrays. It's kind of wash, rinse, and repeat of this little program that we have here. So going back to the problem set, like I mentioned, I'll do a follow-up supplemental video here where I carry on with this particular example, and we'll apply the next step, which is to use a method to load the array, and then also use a method to determine and return the mean average of numbers. This will be pretty short, but I do want to spend a little bit of time explaining how the passing of reference types works with methods, because that's a little bit different than what we know at this point. So look for that in a follow-up video. And then you can follow along there. And the remaining questions then, right? So questions 3 and 4, I'm going to strongly recommend you try to do these on your own. So number 3 is just a further extension. So it says make a copy, right? So don't just keep editing the same program. This program effectively will be kind of done. So you'll make a copy, save as a new project. I'm just going to update the existing one. And then the reason for that is so that you have these incremental projects that you can go back to and look at. So, but it's just a modification of the previous one, and you're going to add some additional methods to it. So you'll have a method that determines the mean average. You'll be tasked here with making methods to determine the max, the min, and the mode. Okay, this one will require you to think a little bit about what's going on. And then finally, question 4, like I mentioned at the beginning, this is one that I think you definitely should spend some time on. It's worth your time in preparation for assignment 3. So you're being tasked here with creating a program that will allow the user to enter marks for a quiz. They'll need the ability to enter the total for the quiz, and again, up to but no more than 25 quiz marks. So it's effectively the same program we've just made. But again, I wouldn't start from scratch on this one. I wouldn't just copy and paste from the previous, because you're still building your skills up. You want to prove to yourself that you can do this on your own. And then you'll display a menu to the users. These are the options that they should have. And if they want to display or view the marks, then you should display it out in a table, something like the following. This is a really good practice question, like I mentioned again, for the assignment. So again, strongly encourage you to do that. If you choose not to, I mean, you don't have to, but I think you'll be in a better position if you do tackle that. So, all right, I'll leave it there. Look for the follow-up video to tackle question 2. And if you have any questions, please don't be shy. Reach out to your instructor and make sure you get the feedback and instruction that you need. All right, so until next time.